This is Global Year in Review. The month January was filled with events from the celebration into the new year to terror in New Orleans, South Korean upheaval, the Gaza ceasefire, California's darkest days, the return of Trump. The year 2025 began with a traditional roar of celebration from the Sydney Harbour Bridge to the banks of the Thames and the neon lights of New York City. Millions gathered to welcome a new year with hope and spectacular displays of light. But the festive season and spirit was short-lived as tragedy and political upheaval quickly took center stage. On New Year's Day, horror struck New Orleans. A 42-year-old U.S. Army veteran rammed a truck into a crowd of revelers, killing 14 people and injuring dozens more. The FBI labeled the massacre an act of terrorism. The suspect was killed in a shootout with the police, leaving a city in mourning. In East Asia, a historic political crisis reached its breaking point. On January 15th, South Korean President Yoon Suk-yeol became the first incumbent leader in the nation's history to be arrested. Following a weeks-long standoff over alleged insurrection, the president was taken into custody, signaling a seismic shift in Seoul's political landscape. In the Middle East, a glimmer of hope emerged after 15 months of devastating war. On January 15th, outgoing U.S. President Joe Biden announced a phased ceasefire between Israel and Hamas.
I can announce a ceasefire and a hostage deal has been reached between Israel and Hamas.
The following week saw emotional reunions as hostages like Emily Damari and Romi Gonen were returned to their families. In exchange, hundreds of Palestinian prisoners were released. However, the cost of the conflict remained visible in the skeletal ruins of Gaza, as tens of thousands of displaced people began the slow, perilous journey back to the north. In the United States, Los Angeles faced its worst natural disaster in history. Driven by fierce storms, the Palisades and Eaton fires consumed nearly 40,000 acres combined. 28 people lost their lives and 16,000 structures were reduced to dust. January 20th marked a historic pivot in American politics. Donald Trump was sworn in as the 47th president, completing a remarkable political comeback.
The golden age of America begins right now. From this day forward, our country will flourish and be respected again all over the world.
Wasting no time, Trump immediately signed executive orders rescinding dozens of Biden-era policies and signaled a new era of trade wars, proposing a 10% tariff on China and 25% on Mexico and Canada to combat the fentanyl crisis. February brought a ton of events. February 2025 was the month the American First Doctrine collided head-on with global trade. Invoking the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, President Trump implemented a 25% tariff on Mexico and Canada and an additional 10% on China. The stated goal, stopping the flow of fentanyl and illegal immigration. The move sparked immediate outrage. Canadians boycotted American bourbon, and sports fans booed the Star-Spangled Banner. Though tariffs were briefly paused after Mexico and Canada pledged stricter border enforcement, Trump's rhetoric remained sharp, even suggesting Canada became the 51st state to avoid future levies. While a fragile ceasefire held in Gaza, the diplomatic world was stunned by a new American proposal. Speaking alongside Prime Minister Netanyahu, President Trump suggested the U.S. take full control of the Gaza Strip, displacing the population to humanitarian domains in other countries to rebuild the enclave as the Riviera of the Middle East. The proposal was met with swift rejection by Hamas and confusion globally, peaking when Trump shared an AI-generated video of a futuristic resort-style Gaza featuring a golden statue of himself. The war in Ukraine reached a bitter diplomatic crossroads. In Riyadh, US and Russian delegations met without Ukraine to discuss an end to the conflict. Back in Washington, the tension turned personal. In a stunning Oval Office confrontation, Vice President Vance and President Trump clashed with Volodymyr Zelensky over military aid and the disrespect of litigating the war in front of American media. Zelensky left the White House without a minerals deal, and days later, the US suspended military support, while European allies like Poland and Germany rushed to defend Kyiv. The future of Ukrainian sovereignty appeared more precarious than ever. Despite the diplomatic storm, the people of Ukraine passed on February 24th to mark a somber milestone, 3 years since the full-scale Russian invasion. In the shadows of a suspended aid package, lanterns flickered in Kyiv as a nation remembered its death and braced for more uncertain peace. There were brief moments in humanity amidst the geopolitical maneuvering. 3 gaunt Israeli hostages were released by Hamas, their appearance shocking a nation. In Thailand, families wept with joy as 5 freed Thai nationals returned home, beneficiaries of the tenuous January ceasefire agreement. Europe's largest economy took a sharp turn to the right on February 23rd. Following the collapse of Olaf Scholz's coalition, Germany held federal elections. Friedrich Merz and the CDU-CSU emerged as the victors, but the real story was the surge of the AfD. With the AfD doubling its vote share and gaining vocal support from figures like Elon Musk, Merz now faces the daunting task of forming a government in fractured Bundestag, all while asserting European independence from an increasingly isolationist Washington. On March 1st, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky was welcomed in London by British Prime Minister Keir Starmer. Just 1 day after the public clash with US President Donald Trump in the White House sent shockwaves through Western alliances. European leaders gathered in London the following day, posing for a family photograph before a summit aimed at reviving hopes for peace. Starmer announced plans for a so-called coalition of the willing, saying Britain, Ukraine, and European partners would draft a peace proposal to present to Washington. As doubts grew over continued US military backing, European leaders agreed the continent must take greater responsibility for its own defense. In Brussels, EU Commission President Ursula von der Leyen unveiled plans that could mobilize nearly 800 billion euros to boost Europe's defense industry. This is a moment for Europe, and we are ready to step up, she said. But as diplomacy continued, the war intensified on the ground. Russian missiles and drone strikes hit the eastern Ukrainian city of Dnipropetrovsk, killing civilians, including children, and setting residential buildings ablaze. Days later, Ukraine launched its largest drone attack yet on Moscow, damaging apartment blocks, closing airports, and forcing flights to divert. President Trump said Kyiv had agreed to a ceasefire proposal and expressed hope Russia would follow. President Vladimir Putin said Moscow was open to a truce if only it addressed what he called the root causes of the conflict. Russia later claimed it had retaken the town of Sudza in Kursk region, raising its flag as fighting continued near the border. Both sides later agreed to a limited US-brokered ceasefire on energy infrastructure, but accused each other of repeated violations. In Washington, President Donald Trump delivered his first address of his second term to Congress on March 4th. Declaring that America is back, Trump received loud applause from Republicans, while Democrats protested by holding signs reading "False." The speech highlighted sharp political divisions as Trump praised billionaire Elon Musk and announced the creation of a new Department of Government Efficiency, DOGE, tasked with cutting government waste. April was a month dominated by economic shockwaves, political upheaval, war, tragedy, and moments of historic significance. The month opened with a dramatic escalation in global trade tensions. On April 2nd, US President Donald Trump announced sweeping reciprocal tariffs, matching duties imposed on American goods by other countries. Calling the move Liberation Day, Trump said the United States would impose a 25% tariff on all foreign-made automobiles, declaring an end to what he described as decades of unfair trade. The response from abroad was swift. European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen warned that the tariffs were a major blow to the global economy and said the European Union was prepared to respond if talks with Washington failed. At borders crossing between Canada and the United States, trucks continued to roll, but uncertainty spread through North America's tightly linked supply chains. Automobile Stellantis announced temporary layoffs of 900 workers at U.S. facilities and paused production at plants in Canada and Mexico. Global markets reacted sharply. Asian stocks slid, with Japan's Nikkei hitting an 8th-month low amid fears of a global recession. China retaliated, announcing a 34% tariff on all imported U.S. goods. President Trump urged Americans to hang tough, insisting the pain would lead to long-term economic gains. Thousands of protesters took to the streets of Washington, D.C., accusing Trump of destabilizing the economy and attacking democratic norms. Speaking aboard Air Force One, Trump dismissed market fears, saying economic medicine was sometimes necessary. By April 7th, the European Commission proposed retaliatory tariffs on U.S. imports, while steel plants in Europe braced for fallout. A day later, Trump claimed foreign leaders were scrambling to make deals with Washington. The White House confirmed that tariffs on Chinese goods will rise to more than 100%. On April 9th, Trump's reciprocal tariffs formally took effect, including 104% duties on Chinese imports. Government bond yields surged and Wall Street opened mixed. Ports along the U.S. East Coast continued operating as global trade adjusted to the new reality. Later that day, Trump abruptly announced a 90-day pause on tariffs for many countries, but raised duties on China to 125%. In Asia, South Korea faced its worst political crisis in decades. On April 4th, the Constitutional Court upheld the impeachment of President Yoon Suk-yeol over his brief imposition of martial law the previous year. The ruling immediately removed Yoon from office and triggered a requirement for a new presidential election within 60 days. Supporters of the impeachment celebrated in the streets, hugging and crying with relief. Pro-Yoon demonstrators reacted with anger and grief, some breaking down in tears. Later in the month, Yoon appeared in court to face criminal charges, accused of leading an insurrection. In Ukraine, the war intensified. On April 13th, 2 Russian ballistic missiles slammed in the city of Sumy, killing at least 34 people and wounding more than 100. The strike occurred on Palm Sunday, as residents were traveling, working, and heading to church. Video from the scene showed burning vehicles, wounded civilians, and bodies laying in the streets. Less than 2 weeks later, Kyiv came under a combined missile and drone attack. Explosions lit up the night sky, fires engulfed buildings, and emergency crews raced to rescue survivors. Ukrainian officials said 9 people were killed and more than 70 injured. Away from conflict, history was made in space. On April 14th, a Blue Origin rocket lifted off from the West Texas, carrying 6 women, including pop star Katy Perry, journalist Lauren Sanchez and Gayle King, and 3 scientists. The flight marks the first all-female space mission in more than 60 years. The crew crossed the Kármán line, experiencing weightlessness before safely returning to Earth. Katy Perry emerged from the capsule holding a flower and kissed the ground. On Easter Sunday, April 20th, Pope Francis appeared on the balcony of St. Peter's Basilica to deliver his traditional Urbi et Orbi blessing. It would be his final public appearance. The next day, the Vatican announced that Pope Francis had died at the age of 88 after suffering a stroke and cardiac arrest. Bells tolled across St. Peter's Square as pilgrims and tourists expressed shock and grief. The Apostolic Palace was sealed and the Pope's body laid in state in an open coffin. Crowds queued for hours to pay their respects in Rome and in Francis's home city of Buenos Aires. World leaders gathered at the Vatican on April 26 for the funeral. Francis' coffin was carried through St. Peter's Square before beginning its final journey through Rome. Thousands lined the streets, applauding as the Pope mobile passed historic landmarks. In India-administered Kashmir, suspected militants opened fire on tourists in Pahalgam on April 22nd. 26 people were killed and at least 17 wounded in the deadliest such attack in nearly 2 decades. Security forces launched a major response while survivors were treated in hospital. Protests erupted across the region, with demonstrators demanding justice and accountability. A shutdown brought daily life in parts of Kashmir to a standstill. In Iran, a powerful explosion tore through the Shahid Rajar port in Bandar Abbas on April 26th. At least 40 people were killed and more than 1,200 injured. Drone footage revealed widespread destruction at the country's largest container hub as emergency crews battled fires and searched for survivors. Spain was plunged into darkness at the end of the month. A massive blackout struck much of the Iberian Peninsula, leaving trains stranded and stations packed with passengers forced to sleep overnight. Police directed traffic through unlit streets, while emergency services evacuated commuters trapped on rail lines. Spanish military units distributed food, water, and blankets as transport services slowly resumed. May, marked by war and diplomacy, political upheaval, humanitarian crisis, and historic turning points. From intensifying violence in Ukraine and Gaza to shifting alliances, economic brinkmanship, and the election of the first American Pope, the month underscored a world struggling to balance conflict with compromise. The month began with renewed violence in Ukraine. In the early hours of May 1st, Russian drones struck the Black Sea port city of Odessa, killing 2 people and injuring at least 15 others. Fires broke out in residential buildings as emergency crews worked through the night to evacuate residents and extinguish flames. The war overshadowed Russia's Victory Day celebrations, marking the 80th anniversary of the Soviet Union's defeat of Nazi Germany. President Vladimir Putin was joined in Moscow by Chinese President Xi Jinping as troops marched through Red Square under tight security. Despite Putin's unilateral announcement of a ceasefire from May 8 to 11th, cross-border strikes continued. Diplomatic efforts intensified days later. On May 10th, the leaders of Britain, France, Germany, and Poland traveled together to Kyiv, standing alongside President Volodymyr Zelensky at a memorial for fallen Ukrainian soldiers. Zelensky traveled to Ankara on May 15th for talks with Turkish President Tayyip Erdogan, but Putin declined to attend negotiations in Istanbul, sending a lower-level delegation instead. On May 17th, a Russian drone strike hit a civilian minibus in Ukraine's Sumy region, killing 9 passengers. Zelensky renewed calls for tougher sanctions on Moscow. On May 19th, Putin said after a 2-hour phone call with Trump that Russia was ready to work on the memorandum toward a future peace accord. But days later, Russia launched one of its largest combined drone and missile attacks on Kyiv of the 3-year war, lighting up the night sky with explosions. Trump responding by saying he was not happy with Putin and raised the possibility of new sanctions. By mid-May, Israeli airstrikes killed scores of Palestinians in Gaza as residents searched through rubble for survivors. Israel launched a new ground offensive dubbed Operation Gideon's Chariots, with tanks pushing into Gaza on May 20th. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu said the war would continue until Hamas was defeated and Gaza brought under Israeli security control. Violence spilled beyond the region. On May 21st, 2 Israeli embassy staff were shot and killed outside the Capitol Jewish Museum in Washington, D.C. A suspect was arrested after chanting pro-Palestinian slogans. Under mounting international pressure, Israel allowed limited humanitarian aid into Gaza. Trucks waited at the Kerem Shalom crossing, while desperate crowds rushed aid distribution sites in Rafah, ending nearly 3 months of blockade. Trade tensions eased briefly when US and Chinese officials reached a deal in Geneva to slash reciprocal tariffs following talks described as making substantial progress. Trump then embarked on a tour of Gulf states, securing massive investment commitments from Saudi Arabia. In Riyadh, he announced the lifting of US sanctions on Syria and met interim Syrian President Ahmed el-Sharaa, marking a major shift in US policy. At the Vatican, history unfolded. Following the death of Pope Francis, cardinals gathered in conclave in early March. White smoke rose from the Sistine Chapel on May 8th, signaling the election of a new pope. Chicago-born Cardinal Robert Prevost was elected as Pope Leo XIV, becoming the first American pontiff. Crowds in St. Peter's Square erupted in cheers, waving US flags and weeping with joy. Pope Leo was formally inaugurated on May 18th, greeting the faithful from Pope Mobile before celebrating his inaugural Mass. In Germany, Friedrich Merz signed a coalition agreement and was elected Chancellor after a historic second round of voting, the first such delay in post-war Germany. In France, President Emmanuel Macron sparked headlines after being shoved in the face as he arrived in Vietnam, an incident caught on camera but briefly overshadowed his diplomatic visit. June was a month of escalation and shock. The month opened with bloodshed in Gaza. On June 1st, injured Palestinians were rushed to Nasser Hospital in Khan Yunis after Israeli fire struck near an aid distribution point, killing at least 31 people, according to local health authorities. Ambulances crowded hospital entrances as paramedics carried the wounded through corridors already overwhelmed by months of war. Just days later, on June 3rd, chaos returned to 8 sites in Rafah. At least 27 Palestinians were killed and dozens wounded by Israeli fire near a food distribution point. As Gaza's humanitarian crisis worsened, activists attempted to break the blockade. On June 1st, the Freedom Flotilla Coalition sailed from Italy aboard the ship Madeline, carrying symbolic aid supplies. Climate activist Greta Thunberg said the mission aimed to protect Palestinian human rights and open a humanitarian corridor. But the effort was stopped at sea. Surveillance footage released on June 9th showed the crew seated with hands raised as Israeli forces boarded the British-flagged vessel before it could reach Gaza. Israel later confirmed the ship was under its control. The conflict spilled beyond Gaza. On June 5th, Israeli strikes hit Hezbollah targets in Beirut's southern suburbs for the first time in over a month. Smoke billowed into the sky over the Lebanese capital as tensions along Israel's northern border escalated. In Ukraine, the war entered a new phase. On June 1st, 2 bridges in Russia's Bryansk and Kursk regions were blown up ahead of planned peace talks, killing at least 7 people and injuring dozens. Days later, Ukraine released footage of a major drone strike on 4 Russian military air bases deep inside Russia. The attacks targeted strategic bombers and early warning aircraft, with satellite images later showing destroyed and heavily damaged planes. Ukraine said 41 aircraft was hit using 117 drones, claims Reuters could not independently verify. On June 3rd, Ukraine's security service said it struck the Kerch Bridge linking Russia to Crimea with explosives below the waterline. Russia responded with force. The Middle East was punched and pushed to the brink of a wider war. In the early hours of June 13th, Israel launched what it called Operation Rising Lion, striking Iranian nuclear facilities, missile factories, and military commanders. Smoke rose over Tehran as buildings burned. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu said the operation aimed to eliminate an existential threat to Israel. In Tehran, stunned civilians sat along roadsides as emergency crews responded to the damage. Iran retaliated. On June 14th, projectiles landed in Tel Aviv as air raid sirens wailed across Israel. Missiles streaked across the night sky above Jerusalem, forcing residents into shelters. Israeli neighborhoods were damaged, while Iranian state media later showed fires at an oil refinery near Tehran. On June 19th, Iranian missiles struck Israel again, damaging the Soroka Medical Center in Beersheba. The conflict escalated further on June 21st. US President Donald Trump announced that American forces had carried out strikes on 3 Iranian nuclear sites. On June 23rd, Trump announced what he called a complete and total ceasefire between Israel and Iran, declaring an end to what he dubbed the 12-day war. But hours later, sirens again sounded across Israel, raising doubts about the truce. The following day, Trump publicly expressed frustration over ceasefire violations, using profanity while speaking to reporters on the White House lawn. Tension over immigration erupted in U.S. streets. On June 7th and 8th, federal agents clashed with demonstrators protesting immigration raids in Los Angeles. Pallets and vehicles were set ablaze as riot police fired tear gas. Protesters waved Mexican and Palestinian flags, while fireworks exploded outside a federal detention center. Self-driving Waymo vehicles were torched as demonstrators blocked major highways, including the 101 freeway. President Trump warned protesters against attacking law enforcement, saying, "They spit, we hit." Natural disasters added to the month's toll. The northeastern India, floodwaters inundated parts of Manipur on June 3rd, forcing emergency workers to evacuate residents by boat. In Greece, wildfires swept across the island of Chios on June 22nd, threatening homes and forcing evacuations as firefighters battled flames fanned by strong winds. At month's end, fires also raged near residential areas in Turkey's Hatay province, with smoke billowing over neighborhoods as crews struggled to contain the blaze. July unfolded as one of the most violent and politically consequential months of the year. From the devastation of Gaza and Ukraine to rising global trade tensions, climate disasters, and deadly regional conflicts, the month underscored a world struggling to contain war, humanitarian catastrophe, and economic uncertainty. The month began with some of the heaviest Israeli strikes in Gaza since the war erupted nearly 2 years earlier. On July 1st, Israeli aircraft and tanks struck across northern and southern Gaza. destroying clusters of homes as thousands of residents fled under new evacuation orders. Local health authorities said at least 112 Palestinians were killed in a single day. From across the border in Israel, smoke rose above Gaza's skyline as bombardments continued. That same day, US President Donald Trump announced that Israel had agreed to conditions for a proposed 60-day ceasefire, urging Hamas to accept what he called a final offer. Hamas said it responded in a positive spirit and was prepared to enter talks, raising brief hopes that fighting might cease. In Washington, Eden Alexander, the last known surviving U.S. hostage held by Hamas, visited the White House after his release, standing beside President Trump and the First Lady. On July 12th, dozens were killed near an aid distribution site in Rafah as civilians waited for food. The United Nations later said it had recorded nearly 800 killings near aid points in just 6 weeks. By mid-month, hunger dominated daily life. Malnourished children were treated in Khan Yunis as UNICEF warned that acute malnutrition was rising for a fourth consecutive month. 5-year-old Zainab laid on a hospital bed, her ribs visible as her mother watched helplessly. A strike on Gaza's only Catholic parish injured several people, including its priests, prompting Pope Leo to express sorrow over the attack. As fighting continued, Palestinians were again killed while waiting for food aid near Gaza City, with hospital officials calling the situation catastrophic. Crowds gathered at soup kitchens, pushing forward empty pots in desperate search of food. On July 24th, French President Emmanuel Macron announced France would recognize a Palestinian state at the United Nations in September, a move rejected by Washington but later echoed by Britain. In Ukraine, Russia launched one of its largest aerial assaults of the war. On July 4th, hundreds of drones and missiles targeted Kyiv overnight, injuring dozens and setting buildings ablaze. The same day, Moscow declared full control of Ukraine's eastern Luhansk region, the first entire region to fall under Russian occupation since Crimea. President Trump said he was disappointed after speaking with Vladimir Putin, but described his call with Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky as productive. On July 31st, Russia's strikes killed at least 6 people in Kyiv, including a child, as rescuers carried bodies from the rubble. July also saw escalating trade tensions driven by Washington. President Trump issued tariffs letter to dozens of countries, including Japan, South Korea, India, Brazil, and members of the BRICS bloc. Tariffs ranged from 10 to 50%, including a major levy on copper. Brazil vowed to retaliate if tariffs took effect. Japan and the US later struck a trade deal, followed by a framework agreement with the European Union. South Korea also reached a deal, easing uncertainty for exporters. But by month's end, Trump announced a 25% tariff on Indian goods, further unsettling global markets. Across Europe, extreme heat forced school closures, shut major landmarks, and fueled wildfires from Spain to Turkey. Meanwhile, on July 30th, a powerful 8.7 magnitude earthquake struck off Russia's Kamchatka Peninsula. Tsunami warnings were issued across the Pacific, triggering evacuations in Japan and Hawaii. In southern Syria, deadly clashes erupted between Druze groups, Bedouin fighters, and government forces in Sweda province. Hundreds were killed and thousands displaced. The football world was shaken by tragedy. Liverpool and Portugal forward Diego Jota died in a car crash in Spain at age 27 alongside his brother. Tributes poured in across Europe. Fans gathered at Anfield, laying flowers beneath balloons shaped like his jersey, as the football community mourned a life cut short. August unfolded as a month of high-stakes diplomacy, deepening wars, humanitarian catastrophe, and climate extremes. A world caught between fragile negotiations and relentless conflict. The war in Ukraine once again dominated global attention. At the start of the month, US President Donald Trump announced the deployment of 2 nuclear submarines, responding to what he called provocative statements from Russia's former president, Dmitry Medvedev. The move underscored rising tensions between Washington and Moscow. Behind closed doors, diplomacy intensified. Russian President Vladimir Putin hosted Trump's special envoy in Moscow as Washington pushed for a ceasefire deadline. Days later, Trump confirmed he would meet Putin in Alaska, a summit billed as a potential turning point in Europe's deadliest war since World War II. As global powers prepared for talks, Ukrainians mourned their dead in Kyiv, warning against decisions made without Ukraine's consent. President Volodymyr Zelensky made his position clear. Ukraine would not surrender territory. European leaders rallied behind Kyiv, holding emergency meetings and video calls ahead of the Alaska summit. From Berlin to Paris to London, the message was consistent. Ukraine must be at the table. On August 15th, Trump and Putin met face-to-face in Alaska under heavy security and symbolic displays of military power. Despite hours of talks, no deal was reached. Days later, Zelensky arrived at the White House amid pressure to find an end to the war. While Trump expressed optimism, Russian missiles and drones soon reminded the world how fragile diplomacy remained. By month's end, Kyiv was again under fire. Overnight strikes killed civilians, damaged homes, and even hit the European Union's delegation building, drawing condemnation from across Europe. In the Middle East, the Gaza war deepened into one of the gravest humanitarian crises of the decade. Israel's far-right National Security Minister, Itamar Ben-Gvir, sparked outrage by praying at Jerusalem's El-Quds's compound, calling for Israeli sovereignty over Gaza. Inside Gaza, hunger spread. Long lines formed at makeshift kitchens as families struggled to survive amid shortages of food and aid. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu reiterated his government's war goals, defeating Hamas, freeing hostages, and eliminating threats to Israel. Aid deliveries remain dangerously insufficient. In one tragic incident, a 15-year-old boy was crushed to death by a falling aid pallet during an airdrop, a stark symbol of desperation. The killing of Al Jazeera journalist Anas El-Sharif in an Israeli strike triggered global condemnation. His funeral, along with those of other slain journalists, drew massive crowds in Gaza. Protests erupted inside Israel as demonstrators blocked roads, demanding a hostage deal and an end to the war. Later in the month, Israeli strikes hit Nessar Hospital in Khan Yunis, killing a Reuters cameraman and injuring another journalist, further fueling international concern over the safety of civilians and media workers. Meanwhile, Israeli tanks massed near Gaza as smoke rose from the besieged enclave. The conflict spilled further across the region as Israeli strike in Yemen killed the prime minister of the Houthi-led government along with several ministers. The Houthis vowed retaliation, promising continued missile and drone attacks against Israel. The Middle East urged closer to a wider confrontation. In the Caribbean and Latin America, geopolitical tensions mounted. Venezuela's president, Nicolas Maduro, praised Colombia's troop deployment along their shared border as Israel naval forces surged into the southern Caribbean. American warships docked near the Panama Canal, signaling Washington's growing military footprint in the region. Domestically, Trump invoked extraordinary powers, placing Washington, D.C.'s police under federal control and deploying National Guard troops to the capital. The move sparked protests, with demonstrators accusing the administration of authoritarian overreach. Armored vehicles and soldiers became a visible presence in America's capital. September unfolded as one of the most consequential months of the year. The war in Gaza intensified sharply in September. On the 5th, Palestinians sifted through the rubble of Gaza City's Moshtaba building after an Israeli strike leveled the 14-story structure. On September 12th, the General Assembly overwhelmingly endorsed a declaration backing irreversible steps toward a two-state solution. Within days, Britain, Canada, Australia, and France formally recognized the State of Palestine, a historic move sharply criticized by Israel and the United States. At the UN podium, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu denounced the recognitions, warning they rewarded violence. Delegates walked out as he spoke, while supporters rose to applaud. In Europe, the war in Ukraine reached a new and dangerous phase. Russia launched its largest air assault of the conflict on September 7th, sending more than 800 drones and missiles towards Ukraine. Kyiv's Cabinet of Ministers building was hit, the first time a government building had been damaged since the invasion began. The violence crossed borders. Russian drones violated Polish airspace, forcing Warsaw for the first time to engage Russian assets. NATO and the European Union condemned the incident as reckless, warning Moscow against further escalation. Disaster struck Afghanistan on September 1st. A powerful earthquake killed more than 800 people in eastern provinces, flattening vehicles in Kuna and Nangarhar. Survivors clawed through debris with bare hands, searching for loved ones, as helicopters ferried the injured from remote mountain areas. In Beijing, power and pageantry took center stage. China celebrated 80 years since Japan's defeat in World War II with its largest ever military parade. President Xi Jinping welcomed Russia's Vladimir Putin and North Korea's Kim Jong-un, showcasing advanced missiles, robotic weapons, and growing military might. The message was unmistakable. China's global influence was on full display. The fashion world mourned a giant. Designer Giorgio Armani died at 91, ending a career that defined modern Italian elegance. From Milan to Paris, stores closed as mourners paid tribute to a man whose name became synonymous with timeless style. In Nepal, a social media shutdown sparked nationwide unrest. Youth-led protests against corruption and censorship escalated into clashes with police. Within days, demonstrators stormed parliament, setting parts of the building ablaze, forcing the prime minister's resignation. In Africa, Ethiopia inaugurated the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam, a project years in the making. Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed assured neighbors, Egypt and Sudan, the dam would not threaten Nile water supplies, as water surged through turbines, powering Ethiopia's ambition to become a regional energy hub. The United States was shaken by political violence. Conservative activist Charlie Kirk was fatally shot while speaking at a Utah university, an assassination that triggered national mourning and renewed fears over extremism. Flags flew at half-staff at the White House as President Trump condemned the killings, calling it an attack on American values. Nature delivered its own devastation. Super Typhoon Ragasa, the strongest storm of the year, battered Taiwan and the Philippines. Giant waves swallowed coastlines, rivers burst their banks, and entire towns were flooded as millions fled to safety. Satellite images tracked the storm's destruction path across the region, a stark reminder of intensifying climate extreme. October 2025 began with a Middle East on a knife edge. Tensions peaked on October 2nd as the Israeli Navy intercepted a protest flotilla, detaining 450 activists. Just days later, despite escalating strikes in Gaza, the tide of the 2-year-old war began to turn. The date, October 7th, loomed large, the second anniversary of the Hamas attacks. While Israel paused in grief to remember the victims of the Nova Festival, the gears of diplomacy were turning in Washington. On October 10th, a U.S. brokered ceasefire took place. Despite mutual accusations of violations, the humanitarian corridor opened. By October 13th, the unimaginable happened. The last living Israeli hostages were freed, exchanged for nearly 2,000 Palestinian detainees. The peace was cemented by the direct intervention of US President Donald Trump, who addressed the Knesset and joined leaders in Egypt to sign the accord, signaling what he called a golden age for the region.
Generations from now, this will be remembered as the moment that everything began to change, and change very much for the better.
While peace dawned in the Middle East, the sun remained eclipsed in Eastern Europe. President Zelensky arrived at the White House on October 17th, seeking weapons, only to find a U.S. administration focused on brokered peace. Days later, Russia launched a massive drone and missile assault, plunging Ukraine into darkness and claiming the lives of children. Simultaneously, the US government entered a historic 43-day shutdown, grounding air travel and paralyzing federal services. Across the globe, October was a month of political upheaval. In Sudan, the city of El Fasher fell to the RSF after a brutal 2.5-year siege. In Peru, President Dina Boluarte was ousted by a unanimous vote of moral incapacity, while in Madagascar, a youth-led protest culminated in a military coup. Violence also rocked Brazil, where the deadliest police operation in the country's history left over 120 people dead in Rio de Janeiro. The Caribbean faced the wrath of Hurricane Melissa. The Category 5 storm devastated Jamaica and Cuba, leaving hospitals roofless and neighborhoods submerged. In Europe, a daring heist at the Louvre shocked the art world as thieves used a crane to steal the French crown jewels. Yet, the month ended on a note of recognition. The 2025 Nobel Peace Prize was awarded to Maria Corina Machado for her fight against dictatorship in Venezuela. November was a month of war, diplomacy, disaster, and global uncertainty. In eastern Ukraine, the war with Russia intensified around the embattled city of Pokrovsk. Russian soldiers patrolling deserted streets. As fighting continued, the United States drafted a controversial 28-point peace plan that would leave Russia in control of large parts of Ukrainian territory, while offering Kyiv vague security guarantees. President Zelensky warned Ukraine faced a painful choice between national dignity and the risk of losing a key ally. US-backed talks in Geneva failed to secure an agreement as concerns grew over corruption in Kyiv. Zelensky's powerful chief of staff resigned, deepening political turmoil. US President Donald Trump said negotiations were progressing while pointing to corruption as a major obstacle to ending the war. In the Middle East, the remains of Israeli hostages were returned from Gaza under a deal between Israel and Hamas, ending a 2-year hostage saga. The UN endorsed President Trump's plan for Gaza, authorizing an international stabilization force to oversee a fragile ceasefire. Tensions escalated again when Israel killed Hezbollah's acting chief of staff, Ali Tabai, in an air strike on southern Beirut. In the occupied West Bank, Israeli forces shot 2 Palestinians during a raid in Jenin, footage showing the men appeared unarmed and surrendering. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu asked President Isaac Herzog for a pardon in his long-running corruption trial, saying the case was hindering his ability to govern. Hong Kong was rocked by its deadliest fire in years. A blaze engulfed multiple residential towers, killing at least 159 people. Authorities arrested dozens and launched corruption probes into building renovations blamed for spreading the fire. Across Asia, extreme weather left devastation in its wake. In Washington, President Trump signed legislation ending the longest government shutdown in US history, restoring pay for federal workers and resuming public service. Tension with Venezuela escalated as the US deployed its newest aircraft carrier and launched strikes against suspected drug smuggling vessels. Trump ordered Venezuelan airspace closed and later confirmed speaking with President Nicolas Maduro. President Trump signed legislation ordering the release of Justice Department files linked to convicted sex offender Jeffrey Epstein, pledging transparency in a case that has fueled suspicion and conspiracy theories for years. At the COP30 climate summit in Brazil, delegates were briefly evacuated after a fire broke out at the venue. The summit ended with a compromise deal boosting climate finance for poorer nations, but avoiding any direct mention of fossil fuels. At the G20 summit in South Africa, world leaders issued a joint declaration despite objections from the United States and Argentina, a rare show of unity amid global divisions. In Sudan, the Rapid Support Forces announced a 3-month humanitarian ceasefire after international pressure, offering a fragile pause in a war that has pushed the country toward famine. December 2025 closed a turbulent year. In the historic first journey, Pope Leo embarked on his inaugural overseas trip as head of the Catholic Church, choosing Turkey and Lebanon, 2 regions marked by religious diversity and political tension. Arriving in Ankara, the first American pope was welcomed by Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan, underscoring a message of dialogue between faiths and nations. In Iznik, at the ruins of an ancient basilica, Pope Leo condemned violence carried out in the name of religion, calling instead for unity among divided Christian churches across the Middle East. Thousands gathered in Istanbul as the Pope celebrated Mass before continuing to Lebanon, where he was received by President Joseph Aoun. At the site of the devastating 20-port explosion, the Pope prayed for the dead and their families, bringing a powerful moment of reflection before concluding his first foreign visit, with a Mass attended by tens of thousands. December saw intensified developments in the war in Ukraine, as Russia released footage claiming control of the frontline town of Pokrovsk. President Vladimir Putin escalated rhetoric, threatening to cut Ukraine off from the Black Sea, following drone attacks on Russian tankers. Diplomatic engagement followed. Putin met US President Donald Trump's envoy and son-in-law in Moscow, as Washington pushed for a negotiated settlement. The European Commission proposed using frozen Russian assets to finance Ukraine, while NATO announced more than $4 billion committed to Kyiv's defense needs. But the war's human cost remained visible. Russian missiles and drone attacks damaged key infrastructure near Kyiv and left parts of Odessa without power. As pressure mounted, Ukrainian President Zelensky made a major concession, dropping Ukraine's NATO membership bid in exchange for Western security guarantees. Negotiations involving US and European leaders followed in Berlin, marking one of the most significant diplomatic shifts since the war began. Australia made global headlines by becoming the first country to ban social media for children under 16. Major platforms began deactivating accounts, drawing praise from parents and child advocates, but criticism from tech firms and free speech groups. Prime Minister Anthony Albanese called the move world-leading, while teenagers themselves questioned its effectiveness. Tragedy struck in Sydney's Bondi Beach when gunmen opened fire during a Jewish holiday gathering. 16 people were killed in Australia's deadliest mass shooting in decades, an attack authorities described as terrorism targeting the Jewish community. Drones and aerial footage showed the chaos as police responded. Officials later confirmed the attackers was a father and son. Prime Minister Albanese condemned the violence, calling it an attack on Australia's values as mourners gathered to honor the victims. Venezuelan opposition leader Maria Corina Machado was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize, but secrecy and danger marked her journey. Unable to attend the ceremony, her daughter accepted the prize in Oslo. Machado later appeared publicly after secretly leaving Venezuela, reuniting with her children for the first time in over a year. She warned that President Nicolas Maduro's government was nearing its end, renewing international focus on Venezuela's political crisis. In Washington, US President Donald Trump brokered a peace agreement between the Democratic Republic of Congo and Rwanda, but on the ground, fighting continued. Tensions between Washington and Caracas spiked after the United States seized a Venezuelan oil tanker at sea. President Nicolas Maduro condemned the move as piracy, while confirming renewed support from Russia's Vladimir Putin. President Trump, meanwhile, announced expanded U.S. military action against drug traffickers, signaling a tougher regional stance. Southeast Asia saw renewed conflict as Thailand and Cambodia exchanged accusations over ceasefire violations along their disputed border. Airstrikes, artillery fire, and displacement followed, forcing tens of thousands of civilians into shelters. Despite U.S. mediation efforts, clashes spread to coastal provinces, underlining the fragility of peace agreements in the region. As 2025 drew to a close, December captured a world confronting its divisions through war and diplomacy, tragedy and resilience, faith and political reckoning. The stories of the final month reflected a global community still searching for stability, unity, and hope in an uncertain future.